While you watch this video, the current declining world power faces the emerging economic powerhouse for control of planet Earth. And surprisingly, the battlefield is the moon. And still an explored site that offers resources of incalculable value and a strong strategic advantage to its conqueror. This is a battle that started around 2017 but has its roots much earlier, in a game of intimidation and espionage among world powers that try to disguise itself as exploration for the good of humanity. And I'm talking about the space race.
Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
In 1969, the United States successfully placed astronauts on the moon for the first time in human history through the Apollo 11 mission. But it wouldn't have been possible without the collaboration of Wernher Von Braun, a former Nazi agent who voluntarily surrendered to the US Army at the end of World War II, claiming he wanted to put his knowledge at the service of a country guided by the teachings of the Bible. Well, he actually did it to avoid potential torture from the Soviets if they capture him, but he clearly wasn't going to admit that. Now, the question here is, why would the US, a country supposedly fighting for global freedom, work hand in hand with a Nazi agent accused of multiple war crimes and representing everything they had fiercely fought against? The answer? The V-2 rocket. The first long-range ballistic missile in history, which had instilled terror in allied soldiers during World War II and had been developed, yes, by Wernher Von Braun. Now, the V-2 rocket wasn't particularly deadly. In fact, it is estimated that the 5,000 V-2 rockets launched during World War II caused an average of 1.4 deaths per missile. But the US wanted the V-2 not because it was the deadliest, but because its cruise capability could be combined with a much deadlier weapon. The atomic bomb.
We have used it in order to shorten the agony of war, in order to save the lives of thousands and thousands of young Americans.
In the tense atmosphere of the Cold War, it was imperative for the US to increase its bargaining power and deter any offensive attempts by the Soviet Union. And they knew that a very effective way to do this was to show that they could launch a weapon of mass destruction into the very center of Moscow from a remote position. So from that perspective, the combination of the V-2, the first missile capable of traveling long distances, with the atomic bomb, the deadliest weapon created by man up to that point, made a lot of sense. With Von Braun's help, the US had all the pieces it needed to create weapons that would terrify its enemies. However, they still had to find a way to send the message and demonstrate their power to the whole world without making it look like a direct provocation. And the way they devised to achieve their goal was, at the end, a sinister mix of brilliance and military strategy that would forever change the course of human history. The man in charge of announcing the plans of the US to the world was then-President John F. Kennedy on September 12, 1962 at Rice University.
For the eyes of the world now look into space, to the moon and to the planets beyond. And we have vowed that we shall not see it governed by a hostile flag of conquest, but by a banner of freedom. Yet the vows of this nation can only be fulfilled if we in this nation are first, and therefore we intend to be first. We choose to go to the moon because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills, because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
Yes, the purpose of the space race was to allow the US to demonstrate to its enemies that it had conquered the air war, and therefore anyone who dared to challenge them would pay the consequences. The problem was that, up to that point, it was all just words, and the Soviets had the lead thanks to the launch of Sputnik 1 in 1957, and Laika the dog aboard Sputnik 2 on November 3rd of the same year. So that's why Kennedy wanted to reach the moon. It was the only way to surpass and even minimize the achievements of the Soviet Union and show the world the military superiority of the United States. But it wouldn't be easy. Until that moment, no living being had left planet Earth and returned alive. It was a technical challenge of epic proportions that required a huge investment of resources. Fortunately, they had Von Braun's ingenuity, who would eventually create the Saturn, a rocket capable of putting humans on the moon. Apollo 11 secured the victory for the United States over the Soviet Union, and the Apollo missions continued to serve American purposes well. But by 1972, and already without the military context that motivated it in the first place, lunar exploration had lost its meaning. Additionally, the associated costs could no longer be justified, and that's why Richard Nixon decided to conclude the space program after the Apollo 17 mission. From that moment on, lunar exploration was relegated to the history books. Until now. From those old days to the present, our world has changed radically. In 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, leaving the way clear for the United States to position itself and establish its own rules worldwide. But in recent years, the US has seen its leadership position weaken. Decades of erratic movements have made the US no longer a clear dominator of the world. Meanwhile, during all this time, a new competitor has been gradually but firmly gaining ground on the world stage. And that competitor is China. In recent decades, China has transitioned from being primarily a rural country to one of the strongest and most industrialized economies in the world. The growth of the People's Republic of China is noticeable in many aspects, including space technology. In 1970, they launched their first satellite into orbit, and in 2003 they conducted their first manned spaceflight. By 2019, China became the first country to explore the far side of the moon. Then, in 2020, they completed their own GPS system, and in 2021, their first rover on Mars. In this way, China has narrowed the gap with the US at an impressive speed, becoming a real headache for the North American power, with which it currently maintains tense diplomatic relations. The thing is that the current geopolitical environment presents challenges very different from those faced in the last century during the Cold War, driving the current world powers to confront on a much larger scale, a scale that literally is out of this world. In the past, countries fought for the conquest of territories and primarily for resources. I'm talking about water, gold, oil, but also they were fighting for trade routes. And the reason for that is real simple. The country that controls routes controls the world. As an example, during the 18th century, Britain managed to dominate the world thanks to its mastery of the seas, possessing a naval fleet considered invincible that allowed them to control communications and the passage of goods as they pleased. Today, however, the world is much more divided, borders are more defined, and therefore access to the resources needed by powers to grow is much more limited. That explains why space, being the ultimate trade route, has become the next scenario for the power struggle. But unlike the Cold War, a much weaker Russia has given way to China. And now China and the US will be the main protagonists of the new space race. Just as John F. Kennedy did in 1962, Donald Trump in 2017 announced the return of the United States to the fight for space conquest through the Artemis program, an ambitious project that aims to put humans back on the moon, but this time to establish permanent bases at strategic points on the lunar surface in collaboration with allied space agencies. China, on the other hand, has the ILRS lunar colonization program with the goal of establishing a fully habitable base by 2036. Both powers seek to move their pieces before the other to position themselves strategically, because just like during the Cold War, the current space race has a military objective, only now there is much more at stake. Over the years, we have discovered that the moon is a great repository of resources, and since there are still no limits or international treaties to respect on the lunar territory, the first to establish themselves there will have priority access to those resources. Moreover, they could limit or regulate access to them for others. Among the resources found on the moon are titanium, aluminium, and other minerals necessary for the development of important industries, such as electronics, for example, on which civilization depends heavily. But also at the moon's poles, water has been found that could be broken down into hydrogen and oxygen for use as fuel. And speaking of fuels, it is also believed that helium-3 could be extracted from the moon's surface, a substance that could be used as fuel here on Earth and would represent a clean and economical energy source. Just like in a game of chess where dominating the center of the board provides a strategic advantage for the player who achieves it, gaining a dominant position in space will give the country that obtains it the possibility to monopolize available resources and thus impose its own rules on others. And if we consider that a significant portion of the activities we carry out on Earth comes from space, it's easy to realize the enormous power that rules imposed by the dominator in all aspects, even in war, would have on our society. In a purely speculative scenario, China, in case of winning this race, could impose sanctions on countries that do not follow its political and economic ideology, just as the US currently does. Moreover, a dominant position in space could allow its possessor to monopolize resources beyond the moon, such as those contained in the core of the asteroid 16C, which would be much easier to reach from the moon, where the absence of atmosphere and low gravity greatly facilitate the launch of a spacecraft. A new Cold War has already begun. The US, the declining king of the world, against China, the new global economic power. Whether one wins or loses is still uncertain. What is certain is that the outcome of this war will have a profound impact on our lives, both positively and negatively.